Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Music Podcast. And again, I am joined by master recording engineer and percussionist Giovanni Fusco. Hey, G.
Hey guys, how are y'all?
And we have master engineer and rock star Patrick Klein.
Greetings.
And all the way from Boston, producer Shane.
Happy Memorial Day weekend, everyone. Good to see you.
So what I thought we would do today is start out the conversation maybe by addressing the question, how did we all come together? Today's discussion will pivot around reminiscing over Tin Pan Alley, a well-known recording studio in New York City during the 1990s. And I thought we would just spend a little time talking about how we all came together and found ourselves at Tin Pan Alley. Obviously, we all have different reasons and explanations, but it might be fun to start out today's episode with that conversation.
Sure.
Chronologically?
Chronologically.
Well, if that's the case, then I want to start by saying Darren and I are first cousins. We're a year apart. Our mothers are identical twins. So chronologically, we go back. We're family. So it starts there in terms of the two of us knowing each other.
And then Giovanni and I know each other from the mid 80s onward, from the original Stickworks studio.
Right.
I think an interesting starting point might be to go back to the year 1991 and and to give you to paint a picture about what it was like to be a musician in New York City in 1991. One of the primary ways that you found out about gigs or opportunities was through the Village Voice. They had a fairly robust classified ad section. And anybody who is familiar with the Village Voice, especially back then, knows that, you know, a lot of times some of the ads or opportunities were hit or miss. But every once in a while, there would be an ad that actually represented a real opportunity. I mean, you would have occasionally, you know, national acts or gigs that paid, you know, things of that nature that were, you know, worth pursuing. Well, anyway, in May of 1991, there was an ad looking for a guitarist, and it was a band called DK that was organized by James Doyle Clier, who's gone on to become a well-known playwright and director. But anyway, at the time, there's this ad looking for a guitarist, and one of the specifications was that whoever was auditioning had to be 21. I was 19 at the time, so I was a little nervous that maybe they would check ID or that sort of thing. But just long story short, I auditioned, got the gig, started performing with DK. They had a record out, which was getting a lot of play and buzz on college radio. In fact, I have a copy. I dug this out. This is their single, and it still has the Tower Records sticker on it.
Wow.
Tower Records. Yeah.
I've never seen that. That's cool.
One of the places that DK performed on a frequent basis was the China Club on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I believe it was located on Broadway and 75th Street. And during the 80s and 90s, that was it was a pretty big deal in terms of a, you know, nightclub and place to perform. A lot of celebrities would, you know, show up there. Page Six often covered the social activities that went on at the China Club. Lydia Criss, who was married to Peter Criss, the drummer of Kiss, was hired as the official photographer for DK, especially during some of the gigs in 1992. So when we would perform at the China Club, Lydia Criss was often there taking pictures of the band. And on Friday, October 16th, 1992, and there's a reason I remember this date, DK was performing a record release party at the China Club. And we played the gig. It went pretty well. I remember, you know, feeling like I did a decent job playing that night. Fortunately, I had no idea that Lydia Criss was there with Ace Frehley from Kiss, who was one of my childhood idols. He had been in the audience the whole night, you know, watching the show. And right as we played the encore and finished up, Shane ran over to me. He said, "You're never going to guess who's here." and he told me it was Ace Frehley, and I was like, thank God you didn't tell me any sooner. I would have.
Well, I try. Here's the thing. I tried to. Darren was able to get us a nice table right next to the stage, and sure enough, here comes Ace with the guy from White Lion who he was playing with at the time, James Lorenzo, and they're both standing right next to the stage. So at this point, I'm going over to Darren, trying to get his attention behind Ace, going, look. Due to the lights and whatnot, Darren never saw me, which I guess was a good thing, because we were really, really young at the time. So, just kind of seeing him waltz in, and next thing you know, he's like watching you. That was kind of a surreal moment.
It was, and we got to meet him afterwards and hang out, and it was such a different time. This is long before, the whole meet and greet. Ace was at a different point in his career, so he was very approachable, very friendly, and it was, a total thrill. And I also mentioned, playing in James DeKay's band. I mean, he was always a gentleman and a great guy to work with. Anyway, the drummer in DK ended up being a guy named Claudio Galinsky. And that's
No way. Oh, wow. See?
Yeah, so Claudio started playing with DK, and he and I became friends. And at some point, we realized that it might be fun to branch out and pursue a more commercial sounding rock project, less college radio, more kind of, I don't know, arena rock, for lack of a better description. And Claudio said to me, he's like, there's this guy you got to meet. And that guy ended up being Patrick Klein.
Right, because Claudio and I had been playing together, just the two of us jamming together. And I met him through this woman, Ellen Libman, who had been Toni Bongiovi's rep at the power station. She ended up dating Claudio. They were dating somehow. And she approached me and said, oh, my boyfriend, he's an amazing drummer and he's going to be a big star and you guys have to hook up. She was a total promoter type.
I remember Ellen, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's how Claudio and I got together. And then Claudio brought Darren into the fold. Same thing. He said, this guy, I'm playing with this guy in James DK. I think he would be really good for us. Because Claudio and I had been working on originals for like maybe a year or something, just jamming in his apartment.
Claudio had a loft on 86th Street and Broadway, and I think it was up on the 14th floor, but I might be wrong about that. So that's where we met, and that's where we used to get together and jam and write. And finally, I'd say after about 6 months of developing ideas, we were finally ready to go and record. And Patrick, that's when you said, it's time to go to Tin Pan Alley.
Right. But at some point, how did we get Rob Rivera into the fold?
I don't think he entered until later.
Well, no, because he played on the recordings with me and Darren and Claudio.
Yeah,
The original three songs we did.
Right.
You know what? I probably asked him to play on it. That's what it was. Because he would play on things.
Being part of the studio at the time, he was around. So, you guys were probably like, who should we get to play? Oh, Robert, let's ask him.
Well, and he was amazing. He was also one of the original Tin Pan Alley stickwork partners.
Right.
Yeah, he had technique on par with like Billy Sheehan and Flea.
He was just
monster bass player.
Yeah, Rob was always at the studio, and I ultimately replaced him in Fuzz Box, but probably a year or so before I even joined the band, Rob was always at the studio, and I was in there doing stuff, demoing stuff with Pat, personal stuff. Pat was engineering, and I had Rob play on some of my stuff. If I was having trouble with a take, he could just come in and listen, I'll just bang this out for you, and he did. For a price, but he did it. So,
right. So, and Rob it was interesting because you said you ultimately replaced him as the bass player. He was an amazing bass player, but he had kind of a contentious personality. I mean, I never had any issues with him, but he could be an interesting character to deal with, you know, in a group setting. You know, he was really kind of a loner.
Which is something that happens sometimes when people have an extraordinary level of talent.
Yeah, that's
it can be a situation where, you know, they become potentially isolated, or I don't know, they feel as though other people can't relate to them. Yeah, I don't know if that was the case.
I could say, and I didn't know him very well at all, but he was on another level musically, you know. And I remember a couple of times, like, oh, you know, I'll just, you know, I'll play your parts. I get it. He could see the vision, and you know, I couldn't. He was like a notch up in terms of just that kind of musical genius type.
He was really good at. You didn't have to tell him much. You'd explain. I would say, here, I kind of want it like this, and then he would just run with it to the next level. So
instantly too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The hardest part, I think, was keeping him reined in, because he had, you know, because of his chops and all that, it was hard to get him to play like, you know, 1-4-5.
But he would do it, you know.
He would do it, but yeah,
grumble a little bit.
Yeah.
Now, Giovanni, earlier this year, you shared a picture where it was you and Rob Rivera with some of the members of Billy Sheehan's band, Talas.
Yes.
Yeah. Give us a little background about that picture and how you and Rob met each other and how that led to the inception of Tin Pan Alley, or Stickworks too.
Well, Robert and I, again, you know, he was from just over the border of the Bronx in Yonkers, and he was just part of our kind of Bronx musical crew. So I had known him since the, I'd say early to mid 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd always be hanging around the original Stickwork, you know, working on projects with the other partner, Chris, and blah, blah, blah. But that picture, and I think you and I determined what year that sort of was, 84-ish or something like that. That was taken at a rock club in Yonkers called the Rising Sun, which was locally to us in the Bronx, one of the only real places that acts would come through, either to warm up for their, you know, subsequent tours, or, you know, just a place to play in that area. It was kind of a dump, but they had a killer PA system, and, you know, the place was always packed. So he and I were all, you know, fans of Talas for a while, and other bands and that. So when they, you know, when we found out they were going to play there, we had to go. I mean, so.
Yeah, doing some research on the Rising Sun, I noticed that other bands that had performed there, you had Talas, you had Metallica, Twisted Sister performed there a lot during the early portion of their career.
Yes.
So a rich history in terms of the New York rock music scene.
And if you go back even further, that place existed as a different sort of club, but with equal status, you know, 50s, 40s kind of. There were some heavy hitters in that genre that played there too. So the place had a really cool history. One of the things that people remember most about, about the Rising Sun are the tuna fish can ashtrays that were everywhere. It was just a thing. I don't know why.
Funny.
So anyway, we went to see the show, and we got to chat with the band members of Talas afterwards, and we talked them into taking a photo, and that was that.
And for those who don't know, Billy Sheehan, he was obviously the bass player in Talas, but went on to play bass with David Lee Roth, and then also Mr. Big.
And Talas was such a cool band. They're like one of the bands that should have been huge.
Yeah. Yeah, they were from upstate New York.
They had really cool songs. Their musicianship was off the hook. Vocals were cool.
Well, that's why I was glad to see that David Lee Roth. I mean, if that show was in '84, think about this. Billy, just 2 years later, is playing in sold out arenas in David Lee Roth's band. Yeah. So Darren and I saw that, and they opened with a song called "Shy Boy," which was a Talas song. Yes. But fit the David Lee Roth, Van Halen classic sound really well. So that was their opening song, and I think it was the second song on the Eat 'Em and Smile album too. So it just features some great, shredding and bass shredding too. Just great stuff. Billy was kind of a master, tapping on bass and almost, doubling up what the guitar was doing in a lot of cases, like lead bass.
The Van Halen of bass playing, really, at that time.
Well,
Yeah,
Talas opened for Van Halen in 1980 during their Women and Children First tour.
I saw them open for Van Halen
Interesting.
in Indiana.
Oh my God, here he goes again.
Talas and Van Halen.
God.
I don't know what year it was. It was early. It was 80, 81 at Notre Dame ACC. And I got down pretty close to the front. I ended up getting a pick from Van Halen or whatever. But the thing I remember about that concert was like seeing Talas and like, whoa, who are these guys? But then the guy in front of me threw up all over the floor and everybody had to move out,
Oh, no.
In those days when people would get drunk and vomit at a concert.
Yeah, so maybe it wasn't as glamorous as I thought it would be. It's like all these shows that you had a chance to see, UFO, even Donnie Iris. I can't believe everything we bring up. It's like, oh yeah, I saw them, by the way. My first tour, Scorpions, and like in a club.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
Well, there were so many places to see bands in my general area there because my hometown was situated in between all these kind of hubs like Chicago, South Bend, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis.
And that also brings up the difference from where Darren and I were from, because you mentioned in an earlier podcast how radio was such an important vehicle for these bands in terms of having their little niche. And the Midwest was just way different than upstate New York. And we had kind of corporate pre-programmed radio, a lot of Journey and Top 40 outside of college. So, we didn't have the benefit of being able to tune into a radio station that was playing Triumph and a lot of this AOR stuff.
That's interesting.
I'm sure like
you're a teenager, I didn't know. I just think that's how radio is everywhere. I haven't been anywhere.
I wanted to tell you I was like, you're pretty lucky to have had that. Like we had to kind of find out the grassroots way and just buying records by guessing, oh, this album cover looks cool, or I read about them in a magazine, or they're opening for Kiss or such and such. That's how we found out about it. Radio was really, really not that great where we grew up anyway.
Interesting.
Another interesting story that ties all of us together involves a legendary New York club. This is a quick, fun story going back to the year 1999 when we were in the band Fuzz Box. We all appeared in a movie together. And CBGB's, which was located on 315 Bowery in Lower Manhattan, a very well-known club, strongly associated with the punk rock music scene. Anyway, there was a movie called The Entourage, and they closed down CBGB's for 2 days, turned it into a movie set, and we performed there. It was like a Monday or Tuesday in the middle of the day. Yeah. Do you guys have any recollection from that movie shoot?
Just now that you've mentioned I totally forgot about that. Wow.
It was hot, and there was a lot of hurry up and wait.
Yeah.
That's as with any movie
exactly
situation. That's what I remember, just waiting around.
Like downstairs, I had played CBGB's like dozens and dozens of times in the 90s. I think coincidentally 4 years earlier, my first show with Fuzz Box was at CB's. And then I had a couple of other bands we played there all the time. But for the movie, I believe there was like a downstairs area that I had never been to. I don't know if it was open when the club was open. But that was an area I remember spending a lot of time during the shoot because there was so much downtime. All right, guys, we need you for this, that, and the other. But then, like Pat said, it's this commonplace with movie production. You're just sitting around all day, with little to do.
I don't really remember the downstairs area. The only thing I remember about the CBGB's downstairs was that disgusting bathroom down there.
Well, there was one behind the stage that was notoriously disgusting. I mean, you could actually Google that one. It's famous.
Yeah.
But maybe at that point they were doing something, and there was another area that, because by 2000 or so, CB's was kind of starting to be on its last leg. I don't remember when it closed, but maybe they had opened up some additional seating for the club, but I remember spending time in an area that wasn't normally a place you would hang out if you were to go to a club show there or play there.
There's limited footage from that movie shoot, and I was
going to ask.
I was able to get a VHS copy. It wasn't the final copy, but if you look at any of the promos for some of the Fuzz Box records, you'll see little clips of us performing at CBGB's, and you can always tell because the background, it has a sort of a blue ambience to it, whereas a lot of the other concert footage for some reason looks more surrounded by red hues. The CBGB's lighting was blue, so that's how you can tell.
Well, I'll tell you one thing I remember signing a contract for that shoot that I was going to be paid $900, and I don't remember ever getting a penny.
Yeah.
And I signed that contract at Tin Pan Alley too.
I think there was some contingencies with that.
But we may have been working on some soundtrack tracks too. Like maybe we were asked to demo some stuff at Tin Pan Alley. This is just like a vague memory.
Yeah.
But maybe some of the movie people came down. They gave us some songs to cover and put a twist on. But I do remember that. Guys, I had a question for you. Was it commonplace for bands to buy and bring in their own master tapes and then take them with them? Or is there an archive somewhere of all sorts of random, recordings from Tin Pan Alley potentially? You get tape that could be baked and checked out. Or did you guys have to reuse tape? Because that's what, back in the day, it was tape, right?
It was tape. We tried not to reuse tape as much as we could because that's really not the best scenario. But, people on a budget would reuse their own tapes.
Or they get in like in an emergency situation where they ran out of tape, because you'd sell them, here's what you're going to need.
Yeah.
Yourself a reel of 24-track tape. Here's what, the brand or whatever. And then whatever we had on hand, if they ran out or something, I remember we'd sell it to them. Chris was always like looking to make a buck on whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, we got 15 minutes left on this reel if you want.
Yeah.
At this IPS, or
but
as far as archives, I kind of generally remember that bands had to take their own tapes home with them. I don't think that anybody there wanted to be responsible long term for the safety of anybody's masters. So if there's any hanging around somewhere, gosh, I don't even know where they'd be at this point.
Well, Matt probably has something. There were a bunch of DAT tapes too. Now I happen to have you mentioned it. I do have a DAT tape that has a compilation of stuff that I did there. I remember I made it, ago, so I would have like a demo reel. I do have that.
I've got a bunch of those too. A lot of DATs. I've got some ADAT tapes of things that I thought was, projects that I directly worked on that I somehow became responsible for keeping the ADAT tapes,
It's an interesting observation. I remember in the late 90s where it was such a big deal for the first time to go into Tin Pan Alley and you had a computer monitor, and it was like the first time where you could automate things and the ability to, look at waveforms and, edit via Pro Tools or, whatever editing software you were using. Prior to that, everything was, on the ADATs or the tapes. It was a different time. If you were a musician or a band, we take it for granted today where, you open up your software and as long as you have hard drive space, you're good to go. But back then, you had to buy the tapes. There was calibrations. All of this pre-production had to happen before you could even record.
Right. And then when it switched over from analog, the next phase was those ADAT tapes, which were actually video cassettes that you had to 8 tracks at a time, and you would have to synchronize the machines together if you wanted more than 8 tracks.
Yeah.
And you have to wait for the machines to sync up and rewind. And so that was a whole other technical nightmare because there are always issues with those things.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's what you guys were doing. I was like, what the hell are these guys doing with VHS tapes? You know, because
Yeah.
I mean, you guys were the engineer, you know, the engineers and knew, you know, inside and out every piece of equipment in there. But I was just like, what are they doing with like VHS tapes? Like, what's going on here?
That's what those were. And we were running 3, sometimes 4 linked together with a big remote control. And there'd always be a 5th machine hanging out on the side waiting for one of those to crap out.
Because they would inevitably,
they would.
Just like your VHS recorder at home when it goes on the fritz and it can't read the tape or whatever.
Yeah. I remember buying the first PCIe card for this old Mac 9600 that I had. And I had that with some interface from Motu.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first time we were able to record 2 tracks stereo into the computer and do edits there and then spit them back out to like DAT or something digitally. And that was like, ooh, that was a big deal. That changed a lot of things. And I remember being able to incorporate that and the ADATs together to do some pretty crazy stuff. Together, you know, on Mixdown or just to add tracks and things like that. Because I don't remember ever really having a sampler there. So
there was an SP1200 sampling drum machine.
Yeah, there was
that we brought from French Lick days.
Yeah, I remember
That's
that
the sampler. I really remember, and I used that a lot.
At some point, I don't know when this would have happened, but did you start to feel the effects of the proliferation of, you know, everybody acquiring their own home recording gear and software? Did that start to impact the, you know, the final phases of Tin Pan Alley?
Well, I mean, I was long out of there at that point. By the time it became home studios became really popular.
Right. I do think though that one of the things that did begin to impact the business there were the other bigger, more lucrative, let's say, studios did start to get Pro Tools and this and that and the other thing. And we were kind of straggling behind without it for quite some time. And that may have hurt a little bit.
Yeah, because when those first came out, there weren't a lot of options, and that Pro Tools system was
expensive.
$30,000 you had to drop to get, you know,
just to get in the door with Pro Tools. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that was part of it. And I think, you know, 9/11 was another part of it for a little bit too. People just stopped doing stuff. And you know, there are so many pieces to that puzzle that didn't necessarily just affect Tin Pan Alley. It affected, you know, the whole music industry. I mean, people stopped making demos so much. People stopped, stopped getting record deals because records weren't selling, and then records turned to CDs. And then once the CDs hit, you know, there was software on your home PC that you can rip the tunes off of, and suddenly they all ended up online. So the ability to sell your own CDs kind of, you know, waned. So many things just happened in concert, so to speak.
Well, think about, you know, the emergence of Napster in 2000, you know, followed up by 9/11, followed up by, you know, the real estate explosion in places like Manhattan. It just drove I mean, it was just like the perfect storm.
So many different things.
You know, where it just kind of drove, you know, a lot of these clubs and studios just out of existence. And it's a real shame.
I think one of the things that stands out, and I think about this often, is that back in the 90s, when it came to recording, especially within the context of a band, it was important, first of all, that you had to be rehearsed. And the initial foundation of that recording often required that at least some of the band, if not all of the band, be in the same room and perform together. And that's the thing that I find is missing now. And when I listen to the old recordings from Tin Pan Alley, it sounds like a band. It has that element of human interaction, and you just you lose that with
absolutely agree. I absolutely agree.
Well, it's not to a grid.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things I appreciate about older records now, like your favorite bands that you listen to, like those guys were tight, man, and they didn't have digital editing. You couldn't I mean, you could overdub something if you messed up, go back and record it over, but it was all skill. There was no fudging the
Yeah.
timing and everything. You had
And with the
that had it
playing
together.
simultaneously part too has a lot to do with it. It's not just, oh, here's a drum beat. Oh, let me put a bass on it. Oh, let me put a guitar on it.
Yeah, it's whole vibe.
Oftentimes it's the same person. It's not the same as having a bunch of, a band together individually doing their own thing collectively to make a whole. It's not the same.
Yeah, even with the Fuzz Box recordings, I mean, G and I would have to get together by ourselves with a rhythm section, so bass and drums, along with sometimes a rhythm guitar or a scratch vocal to start things out, but just to make sure everything's locked in as nice as it can be. Also, I've been watching lately on YouTube. They have some great isolation tracks from some earlier recordings that are now available, and part of the beauty is there are some imperfections on historic recordings. I was listening to Warren DeMartini from Rat's isolated solo from Round and Round, and if you listen to it isolated, there's some minor imperfections, but when it's put together with the band, it's perfect.
It doesn't matter.
It's perfect. It's not, and this is like pre-grid. There's just these little imperfections, and I think a lot of it's lost its charm.
And there's bleed too.
Oh, for sure.
It all factors in. Now back to Fuzz Box. This is something I couldn't remember. So Claudio was your drummer. How is it that I ended up in the fold? Did he become busy with something else, or like when and where? How did that happen? I cannot for the life of me remember. Or was it just like,
I
hey?
can't remember either, but I could ask Claudio.
We recorded our first EP in 1995. It's called Inception. It's out on all the streaming services, et cetera, et cetera. I think after that, he was interested in more of a jazz fusion type project, and that was a little more challenging musically speaking. And I think that's what happened. He decided he needed to fully commit to that particular project. And
there I was, the studio rat. You guys were like, "Hey, want to be in a band?"
Yeah, I think he moved to Long Island. He moved from the city to Long Island.
Okay.
And it was so getting together became an issue.
Claudio, now he's gone on to do some cool things as a drummer. Maybe Patrick, you could bring us up to date. He plays in a band called Riot Act.
Well, yeah, Riot Act. I think they're on hold, unfortunately, because sadly, one of the main guitar players passed away from coronavirus.
Oh, wow.
A couple months ago. So, and then that was a band that was from the original members of the band Riot, a New York band. Now he has another band which is called Rock This Town Orchestra. And it's sort of like a Stray Cats-ish Brian Setzer kind of thing. Where they've got an upright bass player and the guitar player has the 50s kind of semi-hollow body thing. And they're booked pretty solidly.
They are an amazing act, man. I've seen some of their videos, and I think they might play like some of the casino circuit and stuff like that, or bigger theaters. Really, really fun to watch. So when things open back up again, if they're ever in your area, man, definitely, I'm going to go in person to check them out because.
Oh yeah, they're all fantastic musicians. Anthony Bambino, Paul Ranieri, and Claudio Galinsky.
I think that one of the final points that we'll make today is just, what a special time it was in the 80s and 90s to have that hub that was Tin Pan Alley where we could all meet up, rehearse, record, it was a special time, and it's something that, speaking for myself, I look back upon it with very fond memories and feel incredibly fortunate and grateful that I had the opportunity to work with you guys and be part of that, because it's a scene that just doesn't really exist anymore, at least not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it was a soul social thing too. And the cool thing was the different, being a musician and sort of artist, all the different characters that came through there.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, again, going back to recording, what was the most interesting recording session? It was just the diversity of all these different people, good and bad, that you came into contact with. It was a real New York City melting experience.
It certainly served its purpose, and I've absolutely got no regrets. I mean, it's what we set out to do, right?
Right.
And we did.
It was.
And we did it our way.
It had a little scene of its own, and I remember even being there doing Fuzz Box basic tapes and basic tracks. And a friend of mine from college would walk by and, oh, what are you doing? I'm in a disco band and we're rehearsing in the back. Or you would just periodically just run into people from the scene or people that you knew that were in and out of there. And you could be recording and there could be a band, rehearsing at the same time. So it was a lot of activity and a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it was a good way to see just how small the musical scene in the city actually was, in a way, because you inevitably knew somebody who knew somebody else who knew, and it just all kind of internet.
Yeah, you're never more than one or two clicks away from whoever.
Yeah, exactly.
And just for like G and I, it was just allowed us to have this lifestyle where we could stay up, kind of make our own hours. I mean, we worked there a lot, but it was like kind of on our own terms.
Yes, living on that edge of reality. Everybody else would get up and do their 9 to 5s, and we just, hey, when do I have to be in? Noon, okay. And,
right.
So then every day was an adventure. You kind of had things booked, but you never really knew when you'd be done or what else you'd be doing afterwards, or if you had a gig. I mean, just between Patrick and I think, how many bands were we simultaneously involved with? Not just you and I, just you on your own and me. I mean, I remember one point where, let's see, it was Fuzz Box, Den of Thieves, Adrian Romero, Paul Brown. I was in like 4 or 5 bands at the same time at one point almost, It was just like lots to do.
Yeah.
Oh, like that makes sense too, like endurance wise, because I remember like Fuzz Box being on a bill multiple times with another band of yours. So you would do double 2 sets, double bill, right? You would, one would open for the other or vice versa. And
Darren too. I think you were in a couple of those other bands at one point, right?
Well, at one point I played keyboards in Den of Thieves.
Yeah.
You did.
Oh, no way.
You did for a couple of shows. And of course, Shane, you had a couple of projects that you were always in and out with too.
I was always in and out. Like I was saying in my last, the last episode, we I had a little part-time job at a medical office, literally just to support going, because I was never really technical enough or even own like a 4-track or an 8-track. So like if I wanted to do it, I needed to do it right and turn that over to someone else to like, let me focus on the music and let someone else worry about the technical end of it.
Right.
A lot of unfinished stuff. And I'm thankful to Darren who's archived some of this stuff because I didn't hold on to it. That's why I brought up master tapes. I don't know where my stuff is. I don't know. I don't really have anything. So some of this stuff that has been unearthed this year, including the second, Fuzz Box record that we were working on. And this is like questions that I would have post discussion. Cause like some of the stuff that was released this year were they outtakes from the first one, but we spent like 4 years recording easily, but there's a second one that I remember some really good songs.
Yeah.
That,
I have rehearsal tapes. I found some rehearsal tapes from that.
Like that song Satisfied is amazing. But we kind of recorded it, but we were doing the second record before the first one was released. I think it was very strange. It took a long time.
Well, we'll go dig that.
Which brings up a point, Shane. You know, a lot of people are always wondering, why does it take this band 2 years to come up with a record? Well, you know, everyone's doing different things too, as you know, you've just proved. It took how long to kind of work through that sort of record, but it's because I was busy and, you know, Patrick was busy and Darren was busy with other things and just trying to carve out that little, you know, couple of hours here and there where we could all be at the same place at the same time was not as easy as you would think, you know.
No, and as we mentioned, it was like after hours, you know, or before hours. You know, we would come to the studio to wake you up. You might be there from a session at 2 a.m, and we're showing up at 10:30 in the morning for rehearsal, and we're like, Giovanni, wake up, and, you know, ringing the bell, 3 cell phones, like, hey, wake up, man, you know, buzz us in already.
Yeah, no cell phones, right? It was just ring the buzzer until somebody answers. Or
it's amazing that we all got to made it to the same place at the same time so regularly, because we used to rehearse like, especially in the later days, easily like twice a week, all the time.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
You know, we were tight.
Yeah.
We can't discuss Tin Pan Alley without discussing the Bunny Deli for
the Ace Deli.
The Ace Deli, yeah.
It's funny, we all thought of that at the same time. You two said
I was actually going to mention that. That place is like almost intertwined. It's just like, you know,
open 24/7 for most of the time.
Yeah.
You know, that was a big plus.
And I'm sure they benefited greatly from having that studio upstairs. You know, anytime anyone needed anything, you know, or if they were on break, they'd go down and get a coffee or something to eat or whatever.
Yeah, night business.
Tuesday's bacon, if they needed
Tuesday's
it.
bacon.
Darren and I went down there one time. We were talking to Sandy, who worked there, and it was on a Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And we said, oh, what, you know, we smell all this bacon, and we're like, what are they doing back there? Because they're like cooking on just a shit ton of bacon. And she's like, oh, that's Tuesday's bacon. Like for the deli sandwiches.
The coolest part is what an indelible part of our lives it became. Did you know, Patrick, that, you know, me and the family head down to the city a couple of years ago? We happened to be in that area, and, you know, the kids were thirsty or whatever. Yeah, let's go to Ace Deli. She was there still, and she remembered us, and she was, you know, we talked about our kids and blah, blah, blah. It was kind of a nice feeling, you know?
Yeah, I'd gone in there a couple times, like from time to time, years, you know, it's been a long time, but I think a couple of years ago I went in there and Jenny was still there.
Yeah. Her kids, I remember when her kids were born, and now they're all like in college and stuff like that. It's a trip. It's a trip.
Well, I think this conversation has the makings of a biopic or a sitcom, and it needs to be developed into one.
Sitcom.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you everybody for tuning in. These are, you know, some fond memories from our days at Tin Pan Alley. I will include some links below to some of the recordings that we produced and recorded at that studio. And have a great weekend, and we will talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Adios.
Bye.